Good morning, everybody, and we will talk about Iowa agriculture as well as agriculture in general in terms of the climate impacts, because you all like to eat, and so your food supply is somewhat impacted by climate out there, and we will draw that message throughout this whole talk and everything. I will point out, in addition to being the laboratory director, if you notice, I'm also the director of the Midwest Climate Hub, which covers all of the Corn Belt right now. So we are charged with looking at the impacts of climate on agriculture, as well as developing decision tools to help farmers adapt and mitigate climate change. So a number of different things that go with that. I want to start out with a primer, and I want to start out with a primer to put everybody in the same level of understanding of the dynamics that are happening out there, because too often I think we tend to look at climate impacts on agriculture from a direct viewpoint, which we look at things like temperature and precipitation and solar radiation and carbon dioxide on plant growth, and those are the direct impacts. They directly impact the growth, they impact the phenology, they impact our production levels at the end of this. But the part that's often forgotten is the indirect impacts. The impacts that climate, those same factors, temperature, precipitation, CO2, and solar radiation have on things like insects, diseases, and weeds. And those populations are changed as much by climate as are the crop itself. And what we see, and there's more and more interest in terms of herbicide-resistant weeds, and I'll just point out a couple things for you, is that plants love CO2. And there's no plant that loves CO2 more than a weed. And in fact, from the time in which CO2 levels were about 320 to 370 parts per million, and a lot of our very invasive weeds, we saw a doubling in plant size. Those plants, we have yet to see an agronomic crop that doubled in weed side over that same piece. So a lot of the herbicide resistance that everybody's concerned about may even really be a CO2 effect in some of our invasive species. The other two that are out there that are extremely interesting from an entirely different point of view is that poison ivy and poison oak have become much more toxic because of their response to higher CO2 levels. So if you're sensitive to those two things, you notice that you don't have to touch those leaves near as often to get a severe outbreak as you do today. And so that's been a response that's out there. And so these are some of the factors that are changing in there. We're seeing expanding ranges of insects. We're seeing expanded ranges of diseases. Weeds have become more invasive in a lot of the different rangeland areas. So these direct and indirect impacts, but underlying it all is that our soil resource, because you think about how we grow our agricultural system, it all really depends upon soil water, nutrients coming out of that soil, and so that soil is a part of the climate response that we have to understand in all of this. And I'll weave all this together as a story for you in going through this in a short period of time. And here's the way you need to think about this. Climate really determines where we grow crops, and weather determines how well they grow. And that's the easy way to think about this from a very interesting viewpoint, because you have yet to see a banana plantation in Iowa. You know, we do see lots of corn and soybeans because bananas are just not well suited in terms of climatology, and our weather will point out as we go along. And if you look at our crop production maps, soybeans, corn, wheat across there, you see where we have things adapted. And in fact, one of the great interesting stories is that we have rapidly expanded corn and soybeans into North Dakota and South Dakota in the last 10 years because it has become slightly warmer, slightly wetter, and producers have discovered that with low cash rents, they don't have to produce 200 bushel corn to get an economic return on it. And $7 corn doesn't hurt either in moving this. But we've seen a rapid expansion, and it's basically displaced wheat, sunflowers and canola as part of that system. And so 10 years ago, you look at that corn and soybean map, it looked entirely different. And so climate really does change where we grow these particular species. You see the wheat areas basically in the Great Plains, and we're concerned about what that warming climate is going to do in terms of moving that wheat belt farther north. Whoops. If you look at production levels, this just happens to be in U.S. production. You can see that we do have variations in our corn production, our soybean production, our wheat production, and those variations up and down are really due to the weather within that particular growing season. And you see that big drop at the ends, both of those, that's the 2012 drought. That's the impact of that drought in there. As large of impact as we saw in the 1988 drought, a number of different things that are going on. You notice, however, that there wasn't a big drop in wheat production. We didn't have a big drop in wheat production because the drought didn't set in until after the wheat was really produced and the grain formation was made. And so that does make a point in terms of looking at our climate change and where do we look at different species across there and what are we going to do in the future of Iowa to look at something beyond two crops. Because I will tell you the bottom line is that that variation in those graphs out there, you haven't seen anything yet in terms of our protected variation in production. Here's the CO2 curve. You've seen this in many different forms, and as I pointed out, from a climate and agriculture point of view, the rising CO2 levels really not a big concern to us. Plants love CO2, they grow faster, everything else. It's the temperature and water impact that are much more of a detrimental impact on crop production as we look into the future. But, and let me draw this out this way and look at some of those long-term trends that we've used in a number of different reports that are going out, and we're using similar ones in the next climate assessment as well. And here's the scary part. If you look in the upper Midwest, winter is going to become a little wetter, springs are going to become a little wetter, but the projection of summer becoming drier is really a major concern. And in the Great Plains, the fall is becoming drier. And you think about the implications of this summer rainfall pattern becoming drier is that we have built our agricultural system in the United States on adequate summer rainfall. And if our summer rainfall is not adequate, we can expect more variation in production because we're really going to see a number of things happen in this overall scenario. You look at the summer rainfall change and just drawing it down so we can see the United States better, is that we're seeing decreases across the central part of the U.S. You see Iowa in there is projected to become a little bit drier in all of this. And so it really is going to matter that we now pay attention to the dynamics of rainfall and our soil resource, because what we really depend upon in our agricultural system across the state is capturing that rainfall, putting it back through that crop in order to produce the grain. And so we are really going to have to pay attention to the soil resource to be able to improve it. And this is not a projection going into the future. Here, climate change is already with us. These are some of the things that are occurring within our signal. This just happens to be spring precipitation in the March-May period. I just pulled out Ames for you in this particular example. There's a lot of variation, and you look in that March through May period among years. The solid line is what we get during the typical months. You can see in the past few years we've been much wetter than normal. What this means for agriculture is what's in the words next to that. We looked at an analysis of the number of workable days that producers have to do their field operations in the period from April through mid-May, a 6-week period. And we looked at the period from 1995 to 2010 compared to what it was in 1979 to 1994. What we found is in that 1995 to 2010 period, we've actually reduced that number of workable field days by 3.7 days. and you think about over a 6-week period, we have almost 4 less days to get that field work done, is a tremendous impact on timing of operations. Means that we are tending to push our operations. We tend to put seed in the ground when it's a little wet. We end up with a lot of compaction. We end up with soil problems. A number of different things that happen as part of that scenario. And it's also the reason that we've seen this rapid expansion of very, very large equipment. And that large equipment is really a result of this phenomena right here in trying to make sure that we can get our field work done. So we see all of these different things that are happening, and so this becomes a reality for you. Here's a projection looking into the future, just to show that we're going to have wetter springs and hotter summers. These are some of the climate scenarios that are out there. Tendency towards wet springs, hotter summers, also wet springs and drier summers as well. That's where those lines are moving across. You look at the 60 to 99 period, and then the red is the up to 2020, and then from 2050 to 2099, is that our climate is just rapidly shifting. And so you think about, we build a whole agricultural enterprise on having that, again, adequate rainfall. If that's not there, then we really need to think differently about our agricultural system. Surface temperatures, as we look into the future, becoming warmer. In this, again, 2020 versus the end of the century sort of thing, the A1, B1 horizon, or A2, B1 scenarios that we've used in a lot of different models that are out there. Just to point out what this really means in terms of impact if we think about a 2 or 3 degree centigrade rise. A 2 or 3 degrees centigrade rise in temperature takes a corn plant and makes it, if we plant it in the early part of April, it basically rushes through its phenological stages so that it is flowering by the middle of June, not typically the middle of July. And so we basically take and crush that phenology of that plant by almost 30 days. So that's how fast it goes through this whole process. At the same time as it goes faster, it also changes the whole synchrony of the plant. And so when it gets real, real warm, what we've shown in controlled environment situations is that yield goes from typically of that 250, 260 bushel yields down to about 70 bushels. Tremendous impact on production just because of those rising temperatures and a number of different things that happen. If you draw this down again in the same types of scenarios we talked about before, you see Iowa's right in the center of becoming warmer in all of this, whether we're in the short period or the long period. So these temperature rises are critical. But here's why it really draws some of these pieces together for you in a little just different point of view. This is analysis we just finished looking at average county soybean yields relative to the quality of that soil that's out there. And this is off of 3 states, Kentucky, Iowa, and Nebraska. The better the soil, the higher the average county yield. That's really that dependence upon how much water is stored within that soil, the quality of that soil, and able to meet the plant's demand for water. Those triangles at the top there are from Nebraska because we only pulled irrigated areas out of Nebraska. If you supply the water to that crop by irrigation, you can take care of the soil problem. But if you don't have the capacity of taking care of that soil problem with irrigation, you're dependent upon the quality of your soil for your average production. And we see the same thing in maize as we go forward. This is how much soybean yields vary across Iowa. In what we lose by weather impacts from year to year, and we've done all sorts of analyses like this. We've looked at the frequency distributions of yield loss and saying where do the plants lose yield during the growing season. Do they lose it because of early growth? They lose it during the period of grain filling? What really causes them to lose that potential yield production that's out there? And you look at and this is Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And to just point out, we've got a lot of times in which we lose 50 to 60% of the potential yield in Kansas, and it's because of short-term droughts that are out there. So that's how impactful. And if Iowa starts looking like Kansas in terms of rainfall distributions, we can expect more and more variation in our production. That's really the bottom line. We've narrowed this down to individual counties to look at this, and just looking at what we've got for observed yields and maximum yields and looking at an analysis. Bottom line is this. The bottom line is that we often worry just about those droughts like 1988, 2012, but in reality what we lose is 20% of our yield, 80% of the time. That's due to short-term water deficits. And those short-term water deficits are not those years like 2012 or even the latter part of 2013 where it didn't rain at all. It's basically the years in which we needed 1.5 inches to 2 inches of rain to replenish that soil profile, and our rainfall events were only about 1/2 inch and 3/4 of an inch. And that's the scenario that really becomes very, very interesting, because when we talk about a drying pattern during the summer, it means that that drying pattern really is taking us to the point of having more erratic rainfall, less rainfall, and a number of different things. It doesn't mean it's totally dry. But here's the point in all of this, is that we can manage some of this by improving our soils, improving the water holding capacity of our soils, reducing the runoff out of that, improving that soil resources part of the climate resilience factor that's out there. So when we talk about mitigation strategies that improve the soil, they have a direct benefit back to yield and all of this. So here's what we can expect. We can expect greater yield variation in our fields because of variable precipitation. Then that's one of the attributes of climate, both from frequency as well as distribution of rainfall. We can expect greater variation among years due to these extremes in temperature and precipitation. So we're going to see lots of changes in that curve as we go forward in terms of things up and down. We're going to see it on an individual field basis, on an individual producer. We're going to see it on a statewide basis in terms of what do we have for this. But the bottom line is that we really need to think about managing our soil resource as part of the climate change aspect, because that's our reservoir for capturing and holding water for this plant. So, Betsy, that's it.